Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Tomas Morin. We'll just get straight into the questions. Something I ask everyone that comes on here is, what's so special about poetry and why would you pursue it over another medium? Considering that you may dabble in other mediums as well, what draws you back to poetry specifically?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that really draws me to poetry is how poetry can contain so much in such few words. You know, a poem can contain the entire emotional world of a novel in just 20 lines. So it's not so much that it's concise, rather it's that the language is condensed. Things can have multiple meanings, and then the second or third meaning of one thing, when you think about it in relationship to the first meaning of something else, gives you a whole new layer. And what I mean is not so much what is often well, I shouldn't say is often taught in high schools. Rather, I should say when I was a high school student, poetry was taught in such a way that we were told each poem had one meaning. The class had a chance to guess what that meaning was. And after we all guessed wrong, the teacher told us what the meaning was, what the correct meaning was. And as a poet, as a writer of poems, I was so happy to discover that that's just not how poems are. Reading a poem can be similar to going to go see a movie at a theater. It's an experience. It's not about what it means. It's about what is your experience.
Yeah.
And that can, and one beautiful thing about poetry is that your experience of a poem when you are 20 can be different. Of that same poem, that experience can be different when you're 30 and different again when you're 40. And it's not that the poem is changing, it's that as you've changed and grown and evolved as a person, you notice things that you didn't notice before, and I suppose one can have that same experience with a novel or a short story, but I feel like a poem lends itself, is open to that kind of creating those kinds of experiences for readers.
Yeah, in my experience, that's definitely been true as well. And something that I notice myself doing when I read poetry in different frames of mind or in different times in my life is that, and I don't want to say that the poem is emptier than a novel or another work of fiction, but it feels more malleable, or there is more room, I think, within it.
Mm-hmm.
And to that degree, you start to fill in, or I start to fill in context that with my own life. And that's what poetry, I think, lends itself to more than other mediums. And I think that's a very important thing. I think that's also part of the reason why people turn to music and the lyrics of music to do the very similar thing. I think that's also poetry. It's really the same thing, and when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think some people forget that, in the beginning, before we had paper and anything to write on it, poems and songs were the same thing.
Yeah,
They were the same thing. And then at some point in history, they kind of diverged, yeah, in their roots, they're exactly the same thing.
and I wanted to kind of branch off of that. When you were writing poetry, and this is kind of, I will admit, a bit of an ethereal question because it's kind of hard to pinpoint, but when you're writing poetry, do you ever find yourself thinking like, oh, this sounds good, so I'm going to put it here, or this is something that the image popped up in my head, so I'll put it here? Like, what are the kinds of thoughts you're almost talking to yourself when you're writing? What are some examples of those kinds of thoughts that you'll have?
Well, I think you just gave two really good examples. I feel like like that's absolutely the kind of internal dialogue that I have in my head for a first draft, where it's like I try to treat writing a first draft like driving a car with no brakes. It's
Mm,
just the gas pedal, and once you get started and you get rolling, you just go until the thing stops. Either you run out of gas or you hit a tree or something, but you just go, and it's about feeling free in that way, and trusting your instincts, trusting your instincts, because that when you get to the second draft and the third draft, that you can change anything that you might be unhappy with. For that first draft, there are no mistakes. You just trust your instincts, and trust that you've put in the work. I was telling my students the other day that writing a poem, I was giving them some poetry exercises, and that poetry exercises, like, they are not the same as writing a poem. I told them, think about it if like a sports analogy, like basketball, for example. You do passing drills, you do layup drills, you do rebounding drills, shooting drills. All of these drills happen in the gymnasium, but they're not the actual game. And but people do these in practice because they're trying to develop this muscle memory, right? This muscle memory, so that when they are in a game, uh, their body will, like, they'll automatically box out, grab the rebound, dribble behind their back in order to avoid a defender, throw an outlet pass, out to someone on the wing to start a fast break, all without thinking, right? But they wouldn't be able to do that if they hadn't put in those 10,000 hours, in the gym,
yeah.
practicing all those drills. And it's the same thing with poetry. With the writing of poetry, you put in all this time practicing, and so that when you sit down and sort of the stars align and the muse is over your shoulder and whispering that you can do this, all of that practice comes into play, and you think, oh, this image would be great here, right? Or, oh, I should do a half rhyme. The seventh line should have a half rhyme that calls back to a sound in the first line. And you're just, things are just firing super fast, and you're just going with it, right? You're going with it. And yeah, you just trust that that practice, right? All those hours you put in practicing will be there.
Yeah, that's definitely so important because the as for me, personally at least, I've always felt that the degree of inspiration that I received at various stages always feels somewhat the same, but the product is always drastically different. And it always
Mm,
depends on if I have been writing a lot recently or if I have been reading a lot recently, then it'll turn out completely different, even if it feels much the same going in at first glance.
yeah.
And I want to touch on something else you mentioned, which was about like the inspiration, the muses, that whole idea, maybe even stereotype about writing poetry. And I wanted to ask, have you developed a system, and what is that kind of system like as for writing when you might not be so divinely inspired? How do you get yourself up and going,
Mhm.
find something to write about, find some way to write about it?
Yeah. That's a great question. John Cleese from Monty Python gave this lecture in, oh gosh, it might have been early 2000s, maybe the 90s, but he gave this lecture to a group of business people on creativity. And ever since I first watched that lecture, I have had all of my creative writing classes watch that lecture on the first day. And you might think, like, well, what does a comedian, right? What does a screenplay writer who makes funny movies like have to teach? Like, what are they able to teach someone who wants to write a poem? Um, what he does is, well, he does two things that I think are wonderful. One is he says that everyone has talent. Get that out of the way. And then secondly, that in order to access and nurture that talent, our creativity, we have to create a space he talks about some sociologists and references them, and talks about these two modes, the open mode and the closed mode. In the closed mode, we're getting things done. We have a to-do list, we're checking things off, we're going about our day. But that's different than the open mode, which is just making room to just let thoughts like come in on one side of our brain and then go out the other, without anything to do, without anything making any kind of demand on our time. It's basically, it's time for play. And he said, children oftentimes live in, especially when they're small, live in just the open mode. But then as they grow a little older, they have school. Now they have this they have to do and that they have to do and get ready for this. Then they start going, back and forth. But as adults, we often lose that open mode. It's not that we lose it, rather it's that we stop making time for it. And he said that creatives, people who are creatives in all different fields, one of the things that these studies that he referenced demonstrate is that they all make time for the open mode. So if you want to write something and you're sitting there in the open mode, you've set aside the block of time and the space, and everything is like what you need in order to be creative, but nothing happens, that's okay. Part of being creative is, is the waiting. Like what I do sometimes in a moment like that is, so let's say I set aside an hour and a half, and I'm 30 minutes in, I've just been twiddling my thumbs, nothing has happened. I'll pull a book by a writer that I absolutely love and who I would love to write like, but I know I probably never will, because the distance is too far. The distance is too far between where I am and where they are. I'll pull one of their books off the shelf and I'll just start typing their book in like a blank Word document. And to go back to that sports analogy, there's something about using the same keyboard that they used to type that book, and my fingers going through the same motions. It's almost like, again, like in sports, if you're watching tape, right? You're watching film and you're studying someone's moves. You go out to the court, right? Or to the field or wherever, and then you start trying to emulate those moves to try to feel, what does it feel like to, to do that? It's the same thing. It's the same thing for writing. So I sit down and I never actually finish typing the book. There's something about, after I get a few pages in, where like it's like fireworks start going off. They start going off in my head, and then I'll close that down, and then I'll start writing my own things. Yeah, that's something that really helps me. And it also makes me feel like, writing is a solitary act, even though you can have community, but it makes me feel like I have some company, some company. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
You also get to know that work at a deeper level, because you start noticing things like word order, how punctuation is contributing, to the thing, how they're pacing out short sentences with long sentences, if it's prose, how they're paragraphing. You really start, it's almost like looking at the X-ray, the X-ray of a book.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why that's so interesting to me is because it's I've always seen it as a very common exercise to base a piece of work or model it off of another piece of work, and it's something I unintentionally did a lot when I was just starting, and then I would go back and look at it like, I just ripped this off, like there's nothing unique about this one. But I think your idea is almost like the converse of that, and forgive me if I'm using the wrong term here, but it's like instead of taking the work and basing your work off of it, you're just taking the work as a kind of, as it is, and then just writing off of that idea almost. And I think that's something really interesting to think about, is just that, just in general, putting yourself into the work, whatever way that might be, is very important for getting the inspiration to write. There have been many times where just reading a poem where I was like, that's so good. And then like a little bit after that, then I'm inspired to actually like write more.
Yeah. Right, because what you're borrowing is not the language, but the energy,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was trying to
It's
say.
yeah, it's yeah, that energy you're borrowing it, and it's like you know, the Olympics are on, so I can't help but think of the Olympics, but it's like lighting one torch, right, with another, you know, and it gets you going. Yeah.
Yeah. And one last question before we get into the
Mhm.
poem is I kind of wanted to ask, so after all your experience as a writer, as a poet, have you ever found some steadfast ways to look at a line or look at a stanza or a poem and then be like, yeah, I think this is good, or I think I'll keep it like this? Or are you always, even with your published and completed work, you will go back and be like, I could have fixed this, or this could have been like
Mhm.
that, or whatever?
Um, you know, I was like that in the beginning where there's something about like when you're getting ready to send work out to the editors of journals and magazines, that it makes you a better editor. It makes your editorial skills even sharper. It makes your eyes sharper for your own work. So in the early days, I would send something off and I'd be like, oh, I know exactly what I should have done. I should have fixed it, but it was too late. And I would think like, well, you know, if it gets accepted, maybe they'll let me change it. And if not, I have a chance to fix it before I send it back out. And then eventually I got to a place where I realized, okay, these poems are getting rejected, not because they have some sort of flaw, but rather because they're just not what the editor needs or what the editor is looking for. So at that point, I felt like, okay, these poems are as done as I can make them. You know, they're as done as I can make them. Let's say as done as 2012 me can make them, you know, and then I would send them out, you know, and if they got picked up, and then I collected them in a book later, um, I wouldn't change them. Like I'd heard stories of like the poet Galway Canal. This is probably apocryphal. It's not true, but someone had like one of the stories that had circulated was that he once walked into a bookstore, pulled a copy of his book, pulled a copy of his book off the shelf, pulled out a pen and started making changes, like right there in the store. And he was a like a persistent reviser. Like he selected poems, like they had little notes, and then they talked about how, you know, that the poems had been changed and revised. And for me, I felt like if I did that, and everyone is different, but if I was, you know, revising a poem that was going to be a book in a book in, let's say, 2016, and I'd finished that poem and published it in 2012, I felt like, okay, well, 2016 me hopefully has more skill and knows more and just has more hours right under my belt, and I could probably make little tweaks to make that poem, you know, stronger. But I felt like that would be a sort of betrayal of 2012 me. Like 2012 me did the best he could. He did the best he could, and the poem found a home. And you know, an editor put it out there and supported it. And I felt like rather than spend my time trying to fix things from the past, I'd rather just pour that time into making new things, you know, making new work, and just again, just honor the process that, you know, I did the best I could. And you know, if the poem feels like it needs a lot of work, and it was, you know, again, like it was published in a journal 5 years ago, then I probably wouldn't put it in a book. You know, it wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't make the cut. Like my poems that make it into my books are the ones that still feel fresh to me, that I feel like I can still stand by, and that I feel, you know, are saying things that I'm interested in and creating experiences that I want to share, you know, with readers.
Yeah. And if you're ready, we can get into the poem.
Yeah. Okay. So this poem is titled Heretic That I Am, and it's from my new collection, Machete. Heretic that I am. 3 days now, the mold has advanced across the face of the peach I caught with one hand, like Willie Mays, saving it from the sidewalk and its army of black shoes. And how could it happen that my peach turned into Castro, the young one, who regularly baptized the microphone in the first row of sleepy workers with his spit and anger and love? What is love, if not a commitment to fatigues? And I wonder if he wore sea green trunks to the beach or olive pajamas with padded feet. I have to know if mold lived in his crisper too. And did it goose step even in that temple of cleanliness before which he kneeled and hunted the last rebellious grape, unwilling to bear the tyranny of vines? This morning, I am the one kneeling and praying in the kitchen over the beard of my communist peach, how it's a second cousin of the hacky sack, albeit spongier, like a meatball, which reminds me the letter M is for Marx, and for moonshot, and for miracle. And sooner or later, M is also for mercy. Mercy, we have beauty. Mercy, we can't live forever. Mercy, we have time and rot to work our stubborn flesh away from the bald, pale soul that screams with joy when it pops up and free toward the first night of October in Indian summer.
Thank you. That
You're
was
welcome.
incredible.
One thing I did change about this poem, so this is one exception I made from when it was first published in a magazine, is that I changed the tense from present tense when I talked about Castro
Mhm.
to past tense because he passed away.
Okay.
From the time between the poem was in a magazine to when it ended up in a book, I was like,
Mhm.
I should probably just change that. It was just like 2 words, but change that to past tense.
Yeah. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You're real, and I'm glad we could connect and have this conversation.